Imagine a morning in the 9th century. A coastal village in the British Isles wakes up slowly. Dogs are barking in the distance, smoke is rising from longhouses, and the smell of bread is baking on flat stones near a hearth. The sea is calm. Too calm. A farmer walks toward the shoreline, and something stops him cold. It's not a sound, not a scream. It's the shore itself. And tracks. Deep, heavy tracks pressed into the sand by dozens of boots, leading into the trees and back again, toward a tide that's already swallowed all evidence of how they arrived. There are no ships anchored in the bay, no cooking fires still smoldering on the beach, nothing left behind. But the grain store is empty, the livestock is gone, and 2 monks who walked this road at dawn are missing. Somewhere, far across the gray water, a fleet of longships is already sailing home, their warriors fed, rested, satisfied, and completely invisible. This is not a story about Viking swords. It's not about berserkers or the sound of axes on shields. This is a story about something far stranger, far older, and in many ways, far more terrifying than anything found in a saga. This is the story of how the Vikings fed themselves in a way that left no trace, how a cooking method became a weapon, and how fire, stone, and silence became as powerful as any blade. And it all started thousands of years before the first Norsemen ever set sail. To truly understand what the Vikings did, we have to go back further than the Vikings themselves. Much further. If you stand in the Irish countryside on a quiet morning, you'll find them if you know what to look for. Low mounds rising from the ground in soggy fields near streams. They're shaped like kidneys or horseshoes, just a few feet tall, but spread across several meters. They look like nothing, just a trick of the terrain. But when you dig down, you find something extraordinary. Thousands of small, burned, fractured, and blackened stones mixed with charcoal-rich soil. At the center of each mound is a pit, a trough, sometimes lined with wood or stone. These are called fiolate fiad, the burnt mounds. There are nearly 6,000 of them in Ireland alone, with thousands more scattered across Britain, Sweden, and the wider northern world. Radiocarbon dating places most of them in the mid to late Bronze Age, roughly 3,000 years before the time of Christ. For generations, archaeologists just saw black earth and broken stones. Then, someone began to ask the right question. Not what are these, but what happened here? In 1954, an archaeologist named Michael J. O'Kelly decided to find out. He built a replica of one of these sites. He dug a trough, lined it with timber, and filled it with water from a nearby stream. He built a fire and placed stones directly into the flames. When the stones glowed with heat, he moved them one by one into the water. And then he watched something no modern person had seen in over 1,000 years. The water began to boil. Not slowly, but a full rolling boil in just 20 minutes, fed by nothing but the heat stored inside ordinary stone. O'Kelly then took a joint of mutton, wrapped it, and lowered it into the trough. He cooked it, 20 minutes per pound. A nearly 5-kilogram leg of mutton was fully cooked, tender, and nutritious in under 4 hours. No metal pot required. No sophisticated vessel of any kind. Just earth, water, fire, and stone. As the rocks cooled, they cracked and shattered, creating the same heat-fractured stones that had built these mysterious mounds across millennia. Each site had been used, and then the spent stones were cleared from the trough and stacked to the side, and the process began again. Some sites showed evidence of being used hundreds of times. This knowledge did not disappear. It traveled through the Bronze Age, into the Iron Age, through Celtic societies, and across the northern world. The understanding of how fire and stone could boil water without a vessel moved with people, adapted with them, and eventually became part of the world into which the Vikings were born. Scandinavia in the late first millennium is not what popular imagination has made of it. Before we get to the raids, we need to understand the people who built that world. The Norse were farmers, fishermen, craftspeople, poets, and traders. They were also, when necessity demanded, raiders of extraordinary skill. But the raids were not the whole story. They were the edge of it, and the edge is always shaped by what lies beneath. The Viking longhouse is the key to understanding everything. Picture a long, low building of timber, turf, and stone. Inside, a single great room where people and animals shared warmth, through the bitter winter. At the center of that room, the hearth. A simple pit filled with fire, smoke rising through a hole in the roof. The hearth was not just where food was made. It was where life was made. Families gathered around it to hear storytellers weave sagas of gods and heroes. The hearth was sacred, and from it, everything radiated outward. The Norse had iron cauldrons, prized objects that held stews and porridges. A good cauldron was a mark of status, passed down through generations. They also had soapstone vessels, carved from rock found in the mountains of Norway. Soapstone holds heat beautifully and never cracks from sudden cold like iron can. Archaeologists have found hundreds of fragments in ancient Viking settlements, evidence of a culture that cooked constantly and ingeniously. But iron was expensive. Iron was heavy. It was a resource a Viking raider couldn't always carry or afford. This is where the ancient knowledge of the burnt mounds returns. The Vikings didn't forget how to cook without a pot. It was a skill that traveled with them, a secret weapon hidden in plain sight. Imagine a Viking raiding party landing on a foreign shore. They don't need to carry heavy cauldrons. They don't need to risk building a large, smoky fire that would give away their position. Instead, they find a stream. They dig a pit, perhaps lining it with a spare cloak or even just packed clay. They build a small, easily concealed fire and heat stones in it. Once hot, they transfer the stones to the water-filled pit. Within minutes, they have boiling water. They can cook the grain they've taken, stew the livestock they've captured. They can create a hot, nutritious meal quickly and quietly, leaving almost no trace behind. When they're done, what's left? A pit in the ground, which can be quickly filled in. A pile of cracked stones, which look like any other rocks on the beach. A small patch of scorched earth that the next tide or rain will wash away. They could cook, eat, rest, and disappear before anyone in the nearby village even knew they were there. This was tactical cooking. It allowed them to move faster, stay hidden longer, and survive in hostile territory with minimal gear. It gave them an incredible strategic advantage. The silence of their cooking was as valuable as the sharpness of their swords. This isn't just a theory. The sagas themselves, the great epic poems of the Norse, contain hints of this. They speak of earth ovens and cooking in pits. They describe warriors making meals in the wild with methods that sound remarkably similar to the Bronze Age technology O'Kelly rediscovered. The Vikings, masters of adaptation, took this ancient knowledge and perfected it for their own purposes. They turned a simple survival technique into an instrument of stealth and conquest. So the next time you think of Vikings, don't just picture the warriors with their axes and shields. Picture them on a quiet shoreline at dusk, their faces lit not by a raging bonfire, but by the quiet glow of heated stones. Picture them working together, using knowledge passed down for thousands of years, to create a meal that would fuel their journey, and leave their enemies wondering if they were ever there at all. It's a different kind of Viking story, one, not of loud battles, but of quiet ingenuity. It reminds us that sometimes the most powerful weapons are the ones you can't see, and that history is often written, not in blood and iron, but in fire and stone. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this journey into the hidden side of history, be sure to like this video and subscribe for more stories you thought you knew. See you next time. And so they also knew the older way. Liquids that needed to be warmed, says one ancient Norse text, were poured into a suspended animal skin, and then hot stones were dropped in. Even in the comfortable domestic world of the Viking longhouse, the stone boiling technique had not been forgotten. The Viking Ship Museum in Roskilde, Denmark, in its historical guides for people wishing to cook as the Norse once did, notes this tradition, explicitly warning only that one must never use flint stones, for flint, when heated, explodes. Other stones, heated carefully in fire, and moved with tongs or wooden implements into water-filled skins or wooden troughs or clay-lined pits, would bring water to a full boil in minutes and keep it there. This was not a primitive technique. This was a perfected technique. This was the accumulated knowledge of 10,000 years of Northern European life. The understanding that a stone can carry fire inside itself long after the fire is gone, that the earth itself can be transformed into a cooking vessel with nothing more than a trough, water, and time. When the Viking Age began, conventionally marked by the raid on the monastery of Lindisfarne on the northeastern coast of England in the year 793, it did not begin with cooking. It began with screaming, with men in longships arriving at dawn, blades drawn, striking a community so deeply unprepared for violence that the monks inside that holy island had no category for what was happening to them. They wrote afterward of pagans falling from the sky like birds of prey. They prayed that this was divine punishment, because divine punishment at least had logic. Arbitrary pagans arriving from the sea had none. But behind that terrifying edge lay a logistical reality that is seldom examined with the same care as the dramatic raids themselves. Vikings who raided across the North Sea did not bring their entire domestic world with them. They brought weapons, tools, rope, spare timber for ship repair, and food enough for the crossing. But once ashore, they needed to eat. And to eat while remaining invisible, while maintaining the stealth that made them so devastatingly effective, was its own challenge. Consider the tactical genius embedded in the Viking approach to warfare. Historians who have studied Viking raid tactics in depth, with consistent emphasis that stealth and the element of surprise were the central pillars of Norse raiding success. They approached coastal targets under cover of darkness. They exploited rivers to strike deep inland where nobody expected them. They camouflaged their encampments in natural surroundings, using the trees and marshes of the land itself as cover. They never arranged battle times in the courtly manner of Frankish or Anglo-Saxon armies. Deceit, stealth, and ruthlessness were not considered dishonorable. They were the whole strategy. Now imagine that same disciplined culture of stealth applied to the most basic human need, food. An iron cauldron slung over a blazing campfire is a beacon. The smoke rises. The firelight pushes back the darkness in every direction. The sound of metal on metal carries through still forest air. The smell of cooking over a large open flame drifts for considerable distances. A scouting party sent ahead of a defending army would find a traditional campfire cooking site as easily as they would find a lit torch hung in a tree. It announces, "We are here. This is where we are. This is how many of us there are, because this is how large our fire is." The stone boiling technique, by contrast, announces nothing. A Viking raiding party that settled into a hollow near a stream in the English countryside in the dark before a dawn raid could dig a shallow pit, line it quickly with clay, or pack it tight with earth, fill it from the stream heat. Their stones in a small controlled fire that they could build inside a natural depression or a tent of shields too, control the light, and then transfer the heated stones to the trough and cook their meal in near silence. The fire used to heat the stones was small, contained, short-lived. It did not need to stay burning while the food cooked. Once the stones were hot enough, the fire could be extinguished entirely. The cooking continued on stored heat alone, inside a pit in the ground, generating almost no smoke, producing no flame, creating no metallic sound. And when they were done, the stones were cracked and spent and of no further use or value. They could be left behind because they were just stones. Just pieces of the earth they had borrowed and returned in a different form. No iron pot to be found by a scout. No distinctive blacksmithing marks that could identify a forge in a specific Norse region. No heavy metal equipment to slow a retreat. No artifact that said, "A large armed group camped here last night," only broken stones beside a stream. And those were everywhere in the countryside of the ancient world. They said nothing. They revealed nothing. This was the cooking method that terrified enemies. Not because it was violent, not because it was extraordinary in its ingredients or its flavors, but because it was invisible, because it fed armies of men without leaving the evidence that armies had been there, because it was the culinary expression of the same genius that drove Viking tactics as a whole. The genius of being somewhere before you were expected and being gone before you were found. The terror that the Vikings inspired across Europe was not only physical. Modern scholars who have studied the psychology of Viking raiding are careful to make this distinction. The fear they generated was disproportionate to their numbers. A Viking raiding fleet might consist of a few hundred warriors, sometimes fewer. The armies of the Frankish kings or the Anglo-Saxon nobles were often far larger. So why did the sight of Norse longships reduce educated, battle-hardened medieval soldiers to paralysis? Why did monks write of the Vikings as though they were supernatural? Why did the prayer that echoed through European churches, A furor normanorum libera nos. Domini, deliver us from the fury of the Northmen, carry such a note of genuine soul-deep despair? Because of the impossibility of them. Because of the gap between what could be happening and what clearly was. An army you could see coming could be met. An enemy who arranged battle times in advance could be prepared for, even if you lost. But an enemy who appeared from nowhere, struck with devastating speed and coordination, and vanished back into the sea, leaving almost no trace. That enemy lived in the imagination even when absent. The terror was permanent. The coastal communities of England and Ireland came to fear calm seas. Calm seas meant that somewhere out on the horizon, a Norse fleet might be moving. Every morning that the sea was flat and clear was a morning of waiting. Every night with no wind was a night of uncertainty. The Vikings did not have to be present to exercise power. Their absence was itself a form of presence. And the fact that when they camped, they left so little, no significant campfire evidence, no scattered iron cookware, sometimes no material trace whatsoever that a force of armed men had eaten and rested mere miles from a village. This invisibility deepened the already profound fear into something closer to superstition. They seemed to require nothing. They seemed to live on nothing. They appeared from the water, and they disappeared back into it, and the land they had passed through remembered them only in what was missing. The psychological dimensions of this are impossible to overstate. A people who can feed themselves without leaving evidence of having done so occupy a different category in the minds of their enemies than a people who require the usual logistics of survival. The Norse, to those who suffered their raids, seemed not quite human in their needs. They seemed not to eat, not to rest, not to require the ordinary apparatus of life. They seemed to flow through a landscape like water, taking what they needed, leaving nothing behind, governed by completely different rules than the people they struck. This was, of course, not supernatural. It was skill. It was knowledge. It was the accumulated wisdom of a northern culture that had spent generations learning how to survive in cold, dark, resource-limited environments, how to preserve food across brutal winters, how to carry nutrition across long sea voyages, how to cook efficiently with the materials of the land itself, rather than with fragile or heavy equipment. It was the application of that knowledge to war. Back in Scandinavia, in the world that produced the raiders, the connection between fire and stone and community was woven through everything. The Norse understood their domestic hearth as a sacred space. The word for hearth in Old Norse erin carries connotations that extend far beyond simple cooking. It was the center of the home in a spiritual sense, the place where the gods of the household were honored, where important decisions were made, where the bonds of family were renewed each day in the shared warmth and the shared food. The Havamal, the great compilation of Norse wisdom attributed to Odin himself, speaks about the importance of the home fire, about warmth as a fundamental human good, about the relationship between a host and a guest centered on the provision of food and heat. To offer someone a seat by your fire was to offer them protection. To cook for someone was to make a covenant with them. This sacred relationship with fire and stone shaped Viking cooking from its deepest roots. The soapstone vessels they carved were not just tools, they were objects of craft and beauty traded across the Norse world as valuable goods buried, with the dead as grave offerings alongside weapons and jewelry, evidence that a pot was not simply a pot, but a piece of civilization. The iron cauldrons they hung over their hearth fires were treasured in wills and mentioned in sagas, prized as markers of household wealth and generosity. And the older technique, the stone boiling that reached back through the Bronze Age into the deep memory of the northern world, sat beneath all of this like a foundation stone available when everything else was absent, reliable when reliability was the only thing, standing between a warrior and an empty stomach in an enemy land. On the long sea voyages, food was a military calculation. The sagas are full of practical details about what ships carried: dried fish called stockfish, air-cured and so light and hard that it could be kept for months and eaten on board without cooking, simply by soaking in water. Barley flatbread baked on hot stones before departure and sealed against the sea air. Dried meat, salted and smoked. Skyr, the thick fermented dairy product that provided protein and kept well in cold temperatures. Berries and nuts gathered before sailing. A Viking longship carried its food in the way a modern army carries ammunition, Everything counted, everything weighed, everything chosen for maximum nutrition per unit of weight and volume. But a ship could only carry so much. And a campaign that extended beyond the expected duration, or a raiding party that cut deeper inland than anticipated, or a fleet that was delayed by storms. These situations demanded the ability to cook from the land itself. And the land of northern Europe, wherever Vikings raided, the shores of England, the rivers of Francia, the coasts of Ireland, the islands of Scotland, provided exactly what the stone boiling technique required. Earth, water, fire. Nothing else was needed. Nothing else was left behind. There is a particular detail in the historical record of Viking raids that has puzzled archaeologists and historians for generations. In the examination of sites where Viking forces are known to have camped, the material evidence is often remarkably sparse. Compared to the encampments of other medieval military forces, the Norse left relatively little. The ash layers are thin. The fire pits are shallow and brief. The remnants of iron and bronze that might identify the specific culture of the people who camped there are present sometimes, but often absent or minimal. For a long time, this was attributed simply to Viking mobility. They moved fast. They did not settle. They did not create the kind of deep archaeological record that comes from long occupation. All of this is true, but the cooking method itself also explains part of this absence. A force that cooked its food using heated stones and earthen troughs was a force that left behind only cracked stones and empty holes, neither of which, in the landscape of the early medieval world, meant anything to anyone who found them a day or a week later. They were noise, not signal. They were undistinguishable from the ordinary violence that frost and time and weather inflict on stone every day. The spent cooking stones were not carried. They were not valuable. They were not identifiable. They were left exactly where they fell when the warriors moved on. And the pits were shallow enough that rain and trampling feet erased them quickly. The cooking sites vanished almost as fast as the cooks. Contrast this with the alternative. An iron cauldron, even a modest one, is a significant object. It is heavy, identifiable by style and smithing technique to a specific cultural tradition, potentially traceable to a specific region of origin. It cannot be made to disappear simply by walking away from it. An abandoned iron cauldron at a campsite. Here was a group of people large enough and wealthy enough to carry iron cookware. Here was a culture that knew how to smelt iron in a specific way. Here were people who camped for a significant period of time. It is a story told in metal. The stone boiling method told no story at all. It was silence. And silence was tactical gold. In the Norse understanding of the world, power was not only physical. The universe was threaded through with forces that could be aligned or opposed, that favored the bold and punished the reckless, that rewarded cunning as much as strength. Odin, the chief of the gods, was not primarily a warrior deity. He was a god of knowledge, of wisdom, of strategy, of the kind of intelligence that sees the whole battlefield from above. He gave one of his eyes at the well of Mimir in exchange for cosmic wisdom. He hung on the world tree for 9 days in a self-imposed ordeal to gain the runes, the knowledge of writing and magic and deep truth. He moved through the world in disguise, testing, learning, collecting information. The Viking warrior who understood this theology understood that to be the most fearsome presence in a landscape, he did not always need to be the loudest or the largest. Sometimes, to be the most fearsome meant to be the least visible, to do the most damage and leave the least evidence, to be everywhere and nowhere, to be an absence that was more terrifying than a presence. The cooking fire that left no trace was, in this sense, an expression of Odin's own character. It was wisdom applied to survival. It was the understanding that the world would provide if you knew how to ask without announcing yourself. Every hot stone dropped into a water-filled trough in the pre-dawn darkness of an English meadow was in its small and practical way an act of a people who had learned to move through the world like gods, taking what they needed, leaving behind only the broken fragments of their passage and vanishing before morning into the gray sea. The story did not end with the Viking Age. It could not end there, because the knowledge it represents is far older than any particular people and far more durable than any particular era. The burnt mounds of the Bronze Age continued to be used in some locations into the early medieval period. The stone boiling knowledge that the ancient inhabitants of the British Isles and Scandinavia possessed moved through centuries and cultures like a thread through fabric, sometimes invisible, sometimes surfacing again when necessity called it forward. What the Vikings did with this ancient inheritance was remarkable, not because they invented something new, but because they understood how old knowledge becomes new advantage. They took a cooking technique that had been practiced for 5,000 years across the northern world, and they deployed it in the context of medieval warfare with a precision and an intentionality that transformed it from a domestic survival skill into a strategic asset. They did not need to plan this explicitly. They did not need a general to issue orders about firelight discipline and cooking methods. This knowledge was in the culture. It was in the hands of every Norse man who had ever watched his mother or his grandmother work with hot stones, who had ever filled a skin with water and dropped heated rocks into it to warm milk for a sick child who had grown up knowing that the earth could cook your food if you asked it correctly. That knowledge came with them onto the longships. It came ashore with them in the gray dawn light of raided shores across Europe, and it served them with a faithfulness and a silence that no iron pot could match. We tend, when we think about the violence of the Viking Age, to think of it in terms of the dramatic, the longships with their dragon-headed prows, the shield walls locking together with a sound like thunder, the axes and the swords and the fire arrows and the desperate monks scattering across stone courtyards. We do not tend to think about the meal eaten in darkness the night before. We do not tend to think about the small fire built in a hollow, carefully controlled, used to heat the stones, then extinguished. We do not think about the steam rising briefly from a pit in the earth before the cold air swallowed it, and the warriors sitting quietly around it, eating their stewed meat and their barley porridge and sharpening their weapons and saying, nothing in the village a mile away, sleeping in perfect ignorance of what was coming with the dawn. But those quiet hours before the raid are where the Viking Age truly lived, not in the screaming and the fire, but in the silence and the preparation and the extraordinary discipline of a people who had learned to turn the earth itself into an ally, who had learned that the most powerful presence in a landscape is often the one that cannot be detected, who had learned that an enemy who does not know you are there cannot defend against you, cannot prepare, cannot run, cannot pray with any certainty of which direction to pray toward. The cooking method that left no metal behind was not just a survival technique, it was a philosophy. It was the material expression of a culture's deepest tactical genius, the genius of invisibility, of movement, of striking from the silence that your own discipline has created. The Norse fed themselves as they fought, efficiently, completely, and with no trace of their passage. The broken stones they left behind were not evidence of their weakness. They were evidence of their mastery. Modern archaeology has given us back some of what those silent nights once looked like. Experiments conducted at ancient sites in Ireland and Britain, working from the actual physical evidence of thousands of years of accumulated burnt mounds and heat-fractured stones, have confirmed what O'Kelly demonstrated in 1954. A team of skilled practitioners can bring 70 gallons of water, over 260 liters, to a full, sustained boil in approximately 15 minutes, using nothing but properly selected stones and an open fire. Meat cooks at 20 minutes per pound of weight. A wooden trough dug into wet ground fills naturally from the water table. The entire operation can be broken down and concealed with a minimum of effort and in a minimum of time. This is not primitive technology. It is a technology so efficient, so thoroughly adapted to its environment, so free of dependence on mined metal or imported materials, that it operated without significant change across 5,000 years of Northern European history. A Bronze Age warrior preparing his meal by a marshy Irish stream was doing something functionally identical to what a Norse raider might do in the English countryside more than 2,000 years later. The specifics of their worlds were different. The technology was the same. We live now in an age that is very good at producing evidence of itself. We leave traces everywhere, digital traces, physical traces, traces in the atmosphere and the ocean, and the microplastics threaded through the bodies of every living thing on Earth. We are the most visible civilization in human history. We cannot move without being recorded. We cannot eat without generating packaging. We cannot exist without announcing, in 100 different ways, that we exist. The Vikings knew something we have largely forgotten. that the most powerful thing you can sometimes do is leave nothing behind, that invisibility is its own kind of strength, that the oldest knowledge, the knowledge of fire and stone and water, written into the land itself by 10,000 years of human hands, does not become obsolete just because newer and louder and heavier methods have arrived to replace it. When the stones cracked in those ancient troughs, and the steam rose briefly in the cold morning air, and the warriors ate in silence before the raids that would echo through centuries of history, they were drawing on something that went far deeper than any individual culture or any individual age. They were drawing on the oldest understanding in the human story, that the earth will feed you if you know how to listen, and that the most dangerous man in the room is sometimes the one who makes no sound at all. The mounds are still there, in the Irish countryside, in the Welsh fields, in the boggy ground beside ancient Swedish streams. They sit in the earth like sleeping memories, thousands of them, horseshoe-shaped and silent. Farmers have plowed around them for generations without knowing what they are. Hikers have walked past them without seeing them. They are so unassuming, so much a part of the landscape, that they have existed for 3,000 years without calling attention to themselves, which is perhaps exactly as intended. The fire is long gone. The water has been absorbed back into the earth. The food is gone. The warriors are gone. The whole vast world that produced them is gone. But the stones remain, cracked and blackened and scattered, looking like nothing to anyone who does not know what to look for, speaking only to those who have learned to ask the right questions of the ground beneath their feet. And if you press your hand to one of those old stones on a warm summer afternoon, you will feel only the heat of the sun soaking into ancient rock. But somewhere underneath that warmth is a different heat, older, longer, carried forward from a fire that burned perhaps 3,000 years ago, the cooking fire of a world that is gone, the warmth of a meal eaten in silence before the world changed. Some fires, it seems, never entirely go out, and the most powerful legacies of human ingenuity are often the ones that leave the lightest mark upon the earth, whispering across the centuries, not through monuments or manuscripts, but through the cracked and blackened stones of a technique so perfectly adapted to its purpose that even time itself could not erase the memory of what it once made possible, to be here, to eat, to survive, and to vanish, as though you are never here at all.